It sits on a hill in Central California, 165 rooms, 41 fireplaces. And for the last several decades, the state of California has been paying to keep it alive. No private buyer wanted it. Because the castle doesn't create wealth, it consumes it. This is Hearst Castle, and it's one of the worst financial assets ever created. Before we go inside, understand the scale of what William Randolph Hearst was. Not what he owned, what he was. He was also, structurally, building toward a collapse that would have been obvious to anyone not intoxicated by the scale of their own power. Because Hearst spent money the way other people breathe, not as a conscious act, as a biological function, as something that simply happened continuously without pause or reflection, because stopping felt like the same thing as dying. His art collection alone, accumulated over 5 decades of compulsive acquisition, eventually totaled more than 37,000 individual pieces. Paintings, tapestries, medieval armor, Roman antiquities, Spanish ceilings, entire rooms purchased from European monasteries and shipped across the Atlantic to California. He bought things he had never seen, from catalogs and auction lists, through agents who worked around the clock because the act of acquisition had long since ceased to be about the objects themselves. It was about the velocity, the volume, the sensation that the world was still arriving at his door. And at the center of all of it, on a hilltop on the California coast, was La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill, the project that began in 1919 as a campsite improvement and became, over the following 28 years of continuous construction, one of the most expensive private building projects in American history. His mother had left him the land, 40,000 acres of ranch land on the Central California coast near San Simeon, inherited when he was 34 years old. He had camped there as a child, sleeping in tents on the hilltop, looking out at the ocean and the mountains and the golden California light. When he decided in 1919 to build something more permanent, he called Julia Morgan. Morgan was, by any measure, one of the most gifted architects of her generation. The first woman to receive an architecture certificate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a Berkeley-trained engineer with a reputation for extraordinary precision and an ability to execute projects of staggering complexity on time and on budget. She would spend the next 28 years of her professional life trying to build what William Randolph Hearst wanted. The problem was that William Randolph Hearst did not know what he wanted, or more precisely, what he wanted kept changing, expanding, transforming into something larger and more consuming and more expensive every single time Morgan came close to completing a phase. The original concept was modest by Hearst's eventual standards. A main house, a few guest cottages, gardens, a comfortable retreat for a wealthy man who enjoyed entertaining. Within the first 5 years, it had become something else entirely. The estate kept expanding, new wings, new pools, new villas. Every time it was close to finished, Hearst added more. And underneath all of it, running through the entire complex like a circulatory system, was an infrastructure of water pipes, electrical wiring, heating systems, service corridors, storage facilities, and maintenance requirements that demanded constant, uninterrupted attention. The house was not being built. The house was growing, and it was growing according to a logic that had more to do with Hearst's psychology than with any architectural plan. He had a habit, documented by Morgan in her correspondence, confirmed by guests and staff and construction workers who spent years on the project, of arriving at the hilltop, looking at what had been completed, and immediately envisioning something different. Not something better necessarily, something more. A ceiling he had seen in a photograph of a Spanish palace, a fountain he had purchased at auction and needed a courtyard to contain, a collection of Greek antiquities that required a gallery wing that hadn't been planned, hadn't been budgeted, and would delay the completion of 3 other structures already under construction. Morgan accommodated all of it. She managed a construction crew that at peak operation employed hundreds of workers, living in a camp on the hillside, working in shifts around the schedule of Hearst's visits and deliveries, and constantly evolving demands. She coordinated the transportation of objects so large and so fragile that special equipment had to be designed and manufactured to move them. She solved engineering problems that had no precedent because nobody had ever tried to do what Hearst was trying to do. She also, according to her correspondence, spent a significant portion of her professional energy managing the psychological reality of her client. Because Hearst was not building a house, he was building an argument, an ongoing, 3-dimensional architectural argument with mortality, with impermanence, with the fundamental human terror that everything ends. Every room filled with European antiquity was a statement that he had possession of the permanent. Every ancient Spanish ceiling, every Roman mosaic, every medieval tapestry was evidence that beauty and power could be captured, transferred, owned. That the accumulation of history in one place was a kind of insurance against the future. It was not. It was a bill that would eventually come due in ways that no amount of newspaper revenue could cover. Now consider the operational reality of what Hearst had created by the mid-1930s. The castle, and by then it was genuinely a castle, not a house, not an estate, not a retreat, required a permanent staff of over 100 people to function. Housekeepers, groundskeepers, kitchen staff who maintained a functioning restaurant-scale food operation every day of the year, mechanics, electricians, plumbers, security personnel, animal keepers for the private zoo that occupied the surrounding grounds and contained at one point more than 50 species of exotic animals, including lions, bears, cheetahs, and a small herd of zebras that still, to this day, roam the property as descendants of Hearst's original collection. The kitchen operated continuously because Hearst's guest list operated continuously. At the height of his social influence, the castle entertained a rotating roster of Hollywood celebrities, political figures, European royalty, journalists, business leaders, and intellectuals, all arriving at the private airstrip that Hearst had built at the base of the hill and transported by car up the 5-mile private road to the hilltop. Charlie Chaplin stayed there, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, George Bernard Shaw. The guest book of Hearst Castle reads like a roll call of 20th century eminence, and every single one of them was fed, housed, entertained, and transported at Hearst's expense. The dinner table in the refectory seated around 50 people. The wine cellar held thousands of bottles. The pantries were stocked at a scale that would have supplied a small hotel. The cost of a single weekend at the castle, including food, staff, entertainment, and operational overhead, was substantial enough that it would have funded the annual salary of several American families in the same period. And it ran every weekend, sometimes more. Here's the number that begins to reveal the architecture of collapse. By the late 1930s, Hearst was spending approximately $15 million a year. In 1930s dollars, which translates, adjusted for inflation, to something in the range of $300 million annually in today's money. Not building, spending, consuming, maintaining the velocity of a lifestyle that had been established during the peak of his earning power and had never been allowed to slow down even as the revenue streams that supported it began, quietly, to contract. The Depression hit the newspaper industry hard. Advertising revenues fell, circulation numbers softened. The economic model that had funded the Hearst empire through the 1920s no longer produced the same returns in the 1930s. Hearst responded to this the way he responded to most challenges, by refusing to acknowledge that the parameters of his situation had changed. He continued to acquire art. He continued to build. He continued to entertain. He continued to spend at a rate that assumed the income of his peak years would continue indefinitely, even as the evidence accumulated that it would not. His business manager, Joseph Moore, and later a financial committee appointed to address the mounting crisis, attempted on multiple occasions to explain to Hearst that his spending had structurally exceeded his income, that the gap was not temporary, that without significant changes to the castle, to the art acquisition, to the operational budget, to the entertainment expenses, the empire was heading toward insolvency. Hearst heard these warnings. He acknowledged them. He expressed his intention to address them. And then he bought a 14th century German tapestry for $250,000. Because the castle needed it. The room he was planning required it. The architectural argument he was making to the universe demanded it. The bill kept growing. By 1937, Hearst's personal debts had reached a level that would have been catastrophic for almost any private individual. His total obligations, loans, outstanding construction costs, unpaid accounts with suppliers and dealers and auction houses, exceeded $126 million in 1937 currency. To put that in context, $126 million in 1937 is approximately $2.5 billion today. He was $2.5 billion in debt, and he was still building. The castle didn't collapse, his balance sheet did. The crisis finally became undeniable in 1937 when Hearst's financial situation became public knowledge. Journalists, some of them working for competing newspapers, some of them motivated by the specific pleasure of watching the most powerful press baron in America face a reckoning, began reporting on the scale of the debt. on the art collection that would need to be liquidated, on the possibility that the empire was not, in fact, indestructible. Hearst's response was to hold a sale, not a private, quiet disposal of assets, a sale. In November 1941, a portion of Hearst's art collection was offered for public purchase at a warehouse in Manhattan. The event lasted several months. Ordinary Americans, people who had never set foot in a gallery or attended an auction, walked through the warehouse and purchased pieces of the Hearst collection: medieval armor, Renaissance paintings, ancient pottery, decorative arts accumulated over 5 decades of obsessive acquisition, at prices that reflected the desperation of the seller rather than the value of the objects. It was one of the most significant and most humiliating events in American cultural life of the 20th century. The man who had spent 40 years constructing an argument for the permanence of beauty and power was selling it by the piece at retail to strangers because the bills had finally exceeded the income. And still, the castle stood. Still, the staff maintained it. Still, the construction continued at a reduced pace because Hearst could not bring himself to stop entirely. There is a specific kind of financial pathology that Hearst's situation illustrates with almost clinical precision. It is the pathology of the asset that consumes more than it produces. That exists not as an engine of wealth, but as a monument to the moment of maximum wealth, permanently priced at the cost of its creation, permanently demanding the resources of its operational peak, regardless of whether those resources continue to exist. The castle was not worth less than it cost. In some abstract architectural sense, it may have been worth more. The craftsmanship, the art, the accumulated beauty of the place exceeded what money alone could purchase in any single transaction. But it could not generate income proportional to its cost, and it could not stop costing money. Every day that passed, every pipe that aged, every roof tile that shifted, every landscape that required maintenance, every pool that needed heating, every animal that needed feeding, the castle consumed. It had its own metabolism, its own hunger, and that hunger did not respond to market conditions or income fluctuations or the changed circumstances of its owner. The house ate regardless of whether Hearst could afford to feed it. In 1947, at 84 years old, Hearst was advised by his doctors to leave the castle. The climate at San Simeon, the fog, the elevation, the coastal conditions, was considered unsuitable for a man of his age and health. He moved to Beverly Hills to a house owned by his companion Marion Davies. He would never return to San Simeon. He died in 1951. The castle, as it stood at the moment of his departure in 1947, was essentially the castle as it remains today. The construction that had continued without interruption for 28 years simply stopped. Not completed, stopped. There are rooms in the castle today that exist in a state of permanent incompletion. The unfinished wing that was meant to house the Hearst family, the planned expansion of the gardens that never moved beyond the drawings Morgan had prepared, the structural elements that were framed and roughed in but never finished because the man who demanded them was no longer there to demand them, and without his demand, the momentum of the project simply ceased. The castle stood in silence on its hill for the first time since 1919. And then the question arose, what do you do with it? The Hearst Corporation, the business entity that had managed William Randolph Hearst's empire and survived the financial crises of the 1930s and 1940s to become a durable media company, faced a simple, brutal problem. The castle could not be sold. Not because no one offered to buy it, several offers were made in the years following Hearst's death, but because no private buyer could be found who was willing to accept the full reality of what ownership meant. The maintenance costs alone, for a property of this size, age, and complexity, with pools that had to be maintained, gardens that had to be tended, roofs that covered 165 rooms and had to be repaired, plumbing systems that ran through a structure built over 28 years by multiple contractors using multiple standards, exceeded what any reasonable financial model could support through private ownership. A hotel was considered. The math of converting San Simeon into a luxury resort, reconfiguring the rooms, installing the infrastructure required for commercial operation, managing the regulatory requirements of operating a hospitality business on a property with the historical complexity of Hearst Castle, made the project economically unviable without capital investment that would have exceeded the value of the property itself. A museum was considered. The problem was operational cost versus ticket revenue. Even at maximum visitor capacity, the income generated by admission fees could not cover the maintenance, staffing, and conservation expenses required to preserve the castle at the standard its complexity demanded. Private buyers with sufficient wealth were approached. The conversation always reached the same point: the ongoing cost of ownership, not the purchase price, the monthly, quarterly, annual, inescapable reality of what the castle demanded from whoever held it. Potential buyers, walking through the numbers with their advisors, reached the same conclusion with remarkable consistency. The castle was a trap. Beautiful, extraordinary, historically irreplaceable, and a trap. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation donated Hearst Castle to the state of California. Not sold, donated. The organization that had weathered the financial storms of the Depression, that had survived the debt crises of the late 1930s, that had continued to operate as a profitable media company for decades after William Randolph Hearst's death, looked at the castle on the hill in San Simeon and made a calculation. The value of the tax deduction generated by the donation, combined with the elimination of the ongoing carrying costs of maintaining the property, made the gift more financially rational than any available sale scenario. They gave it away, because giving it away was worth more than keeping it. The state of California accepted the donation and opened Hearst Castle to the public in 1958. It became a state park, a historical monument, one of the most visited tourist attractions in California. Millions of people have walked through its rooms, swum in its pools on specially arranged occasions, stood in its gardens and looked out at the Pacific and tried to comprehend what it meant that a single human being had built all of this. But the state of California has also spent decades grappling with the same problem that defeated the Hearst Corporation. The cost of maintaining the castle consistently exceeds the revenue it generates. The gap is funded by the state, by donations, by grants, by the complicated machinery of public cultural institution finance. Periodic budget crises have threatened the castle's operation. There have been years when the state considered closing it entirely, years when maintenance was deferred in ways that created compounding structural problems, years when the conservation challenges of preserving a century-old complex of this scale and ambition revealed how much the building's survival depends on continuous, expensive, expert intervention. The castle is still being fed. It still has its metabolism. Its hunger has not diminished with age. In some ways, it has grown. Because an old building of this complexity and this ambition is more expensive to maintain than a new one. The costs compound, the problems accumulate. The gap between what the castle demands and what it generates does not close, it widens. Consider what this reveals about the nature of the asset that William Randolph Hearst created. In the conventional understanding of wealth, assets produce returns. A factory produces goods. A rental property produces income. A portfolio of securities produces dividends and capital appreciation. The asset works for the owner. Its presence in the balance sheet represents future value, future income, future optionality. Hearst Castle is the opposite of this. It is an asset that works against its owner. Its presence in any balance sheet represents future cost, future obligation, future constraint. It does not produce income proportional to its value. It demands resources proportional to its ambition, and its ambition was effectively unlimited. Because it was built not by financial logic, but by the compulsive psychology of a man who could not stop, who could not slow down, who used the act of building and buying and filling as an instrument for managing the terror of his own eventual disappearance. The castle was his argument against mortality, and mortality, as arguments go, is patient. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't respond to counteroffers, it simply waits. The castle is still there, Hearst is not. The argument continues on his behalf at California taxpayer expense. There is a quality to Hearst Castle that distinguishes it from other monuments to extreme wealth. It is not simply large, it is relentless. Most great houses, even very ambitious ones, reach a natural conclusion. The builder's vision finds its expression, the construction achieves a state of completion, and the house settles into being what it was built to be. It becomes a fixed thing, a stable object. Hearst Castle never became a fixed thing. It was always in the process of becoming, always in completion, always in movement toward a destination that kept receding as Hearst's imagination moved ahead of the construction. This is, architecturally, a fascinating phenomenon. It is also, financially, a catastrophic one, because a project that cannot conclude cannot be assessed, cannot be valued against a final cost, cannot be measured against any original intention because the original intention has been superseded and superseded and superseded again until the word original has lost its meaning entirely. What Hearst built was not a house, it was a process. an ongoing, continuous, resource-consuming process that required his personal engagement and his personal vision to give it direction, and that produced, as a side effect of that process, a series of extraordinarily beautiful rooms and spaces and objects. But a process cannot be owned in the way that a house can be owned. You cannot put a process on a balance sheet. You cannot sell it to the next buyer and hand over the keys and walk away. When Hearst left in 1947, the process stopped. What remained was the artifact of the process, the rooms, the art, the gardens, the pools, and the ongoing cost of maintaining those artifacts in the absence of the energy that had generated them. The castle without Hearst was like a car without an engine, visually present, structurally imposing, and going nowhere. The animals are perhaps the most surreal element of the Hearst Castle story. The private zoo that Hearst established on the surrounding grounds was, at its peak, one of the largest private animal collections in the United States. He acquired exotic species with the same compulsive energy that he brought to art and architecture: zebras, giraffes, polar bears, gorillas, a varied and improbable assembly of creatures that had no natural relationship to the California coastline, and every relationship to the psychology of a man who wanted the world to come to him. Most of the animals were relocated when the castle was donated to the state. The infrastructure of a private zoo, the enclosures, the feeding regimes, the veterinary care, the specialized staff, was not something the state was equipped to absorb or maintain. But the zebras stayed, or rather, their descendants stayed. The original herd of zebras, left to roam freely on the surrounding ranch land when the zoo was dismantled, has produced multiple generations of descendants who have adapted over the decades to the California coastal environment. They graze on the hillsides below the castle. They appear unexpectedly along the state highway that runs through the former Hearst ranch land, alarming drivers who were not expecting to encounter African wildlife while driving through central California. It is difficult to look at those zebras and not feel something complicated. They are the most honest remaining expression of what Hearst was doing when he built the castle. He was bringing the world to him. He was making his hilltop the center of everything, the place where the exotic and the magnificent and the impossible arrived, as if by gravity, because of the force of his will and his resources. The zebras arrived because Hearst commanded it. They stayed because biology is less responsive to bankruptcy than architecture. They are the part of his project that succeeded in becoming actually and literally self-sustaining. Everything else on that hill is on life support. Walk into the refectory today and you will stand under 15th century Spanish choir stalls that Hearst purchased from a monastery and had shipped across the Atlantic and installed in a room designed to receive them, a room that did not exist until Hearst decided that the choir stalls required it. The ceiling above you is from a different century. The tapestries on the walls are from yet another. The table at which Hearst's guests sat, the same table where Winston Churchill discussed the state of Europe and Clark Gable charmed the room, and Hearst himself sat at the center, presiding over a gathering that confirmed his position as the man at the center of everything, is still there. The room is real, the objects are real, the beauty is real, but the person it was built for is gone, and the financial reality that made it possible is gone with him. What remains is a kind of architectural ghost, a space that continues to exist in the precise form of its creator's intention, preserved at public expense, visited by tourists who pay admission to stand inside the dream of a man who could not stop building until he ran out of money. There is something almost Shakespearean about this. The king who built a kingdom and discovered that kingdoms require kings, and that kings are mortal, and that the kingdom's appetite outlasts its creator's capacity to feed it. Let's be clear about the financial lesson that Hearst Castle teaches, because it is a lesson that remains relevant and misunderstood in every era of extreme wealth. The lesson is not that Hearst was foolish. He was not foolish. He was one of the most operationally sophisticated business minds of his generation. The empire he built, the newspapers, the magazines, the film studio, the radio network, represented genuine organizational genius. He understood markets, he understood audiences, he understood the mechanics of mass communication and mass persuasion at a level that nobody had achieved before him. The lesson is that intelligence, expertise, and operational sophistication in the domain where wealth is created does not automatically transfer to wisdom in the domain where wealth is deployed. Hearst knew how to make money. He did not understand how the things he built with money could enslave him. The castle was not an investment. It was not an asset in any conventional financial sense. It was a consumption vehicle of almost unlimited appetite, disguised as real estate. Its presence on the balance sheet did not represent value that could be realized. It represented an obligation, an ongoing, compounding, irreducible obligation to maintain, staff, insure, repair, and operate a structure of impossible complexity. And because it was also, for Hearst, an extension of his identity, because the castle and the man had become so thoroughly fused in his psychology and his public image that it was impossible to separate them, he was incapable of applying to it the same rational analysis he would have applied to any business decision. The castle was not subject to cost-benefit analysis. The castle was his soul externalized in marble and mahogany, and 300,000 gallons of heated water. You cannot foreclose on a man's soul, but you can send him the bill for maintaining it. This is the pattern. And it repeats, not always at the scale of Hearst Castle. Not always with the same cast of characters or the same historical backdrop, but the essential architecture of the trap, the asset that becomes the obligation, the monument that demands more than it produces, the house that eats its owner, repeats with remarkable consistency across the history of extreme wealth. Because the impulse that drives it is not a financial impulse, it is a psychological one. It is the impulse to convert the anxiety of impermanence into the reassurance of stone, to build something that will outlast you, that will carry your name forward, that will make an argument on your behalf long after you are gone. It is, at its root, a human impulse, one of the most fundamental ones, the desire to leave something behind, to matter, to be remembered. The problem is that stone is expensive, and permanence, it turns out, has ongoing maintenance costs. The castle today receives roughly 800,000 visitors per year in a normal operating year. At an average ticket price of around $35 for a basic tour, that represents gross revenue somewhere in the range of $28 million annually. Against that revenue, the state maintains a staff, a conservation program, an insurance obligation, a capital improvement budget for ongoing structural maintenance, and the cost of operating the infrastructure, the plumbing, the electrical systems, the pools, the gardens, that Hearst built to serve a private household and that now serves as a public attraction. The numbers do not work cleanly. They have never worked cleanly. There is a permanent structural gap between what the castle costs and what the castle produces. This is the financial legacy of William Randolph Hearst. Not the art collection, not the newspaper empire, not the political influence. The gap. A gap that was baked into the castle from the moment Hearst decided that what he needed was not a comfortable retreat, but an argument with mortality. A gap that no amount of ticket revenue or state subsidy or philanthropic donation has been able to close because the castle's appetite was set at the moment of its creation and does not respond to the financial reality of subsequent eras. The house set its own terms, and it has enforced them ever since. There is a moment, documented in various accounts of the castle's construction, that has stayed with me as perhaps the most revealing detail in the entire story. At some point in the early 1930s, Julia Morgan, exhausted, overextended, having dedicated more than a decade of her professional life to the project, asked Hearst directly when the construction would be complete, when they would be able to say that the castle was finished. Hearst's answer, reportedly given without hesitation, was, never. Not because there were so many things left to build, but because the act of completion was, for him, a form of death. The day the castle was finished was the day it stopped being his in the way he needed it to be his, not as an object, but as a process, not as a house, but as an ongoing expression of his will encountering the world and reshaping it to his vision. To finish the castle was to admit that the vision had limits, that there were things he had decided not to do, rooms he had chosen not to build, acquisitions he had declined. It was to admit the existence of a boundary. William Randolph Hearst did not believe in boundaries. The castle reflects this. It is, in its deepest structural logic, a building without a concept of completion. A building that was designed, psychologically if not architecturally, to consume indefinitely, to demand indefinitely, to cost indefinitely. And it has fulfilled its design with perfect fidelity, long after the man who designed it is gone. What would it cost today to build Hearst Castle from scratch? This is an almost meaningless question because the specific combination of circumstances that produced the castle, the availability of European antiquities at the prices Hearst paid, the labor costs of the 1920s and 1930s, the particular skills of Julia Morgan and her construction team, the access to materials and craftsmanship that no longer exists in the same form, cannot be replicated. But as an exercise in financial imagination, architectural historians who have studied the question estimate that constructing a structure of comparable scale and quality from contemporary materials and labor would cost somewhere between $400 and $600 million. That estimate does not include the art, the furniture, the antiquities, the tapestries, the Roman temple facades, the handcrafted tilework in the pools, the 16th century ceilings, the items that Hearst spent 5 decades and incalculable sums acquiring and that are now integral to the castle's character and value. Include those and the contemporary replacement cost of Hearst Castle as a collection of objects and architecture likely exceeds $1 billion. A billion-dollar property that cannot find a private buyer. That has been maintained by the state of California for more than 6 decades because no private entity has been willing to absorb its carrying costs. That generates roughly $28 million a year in admission revenue against maintenance and operational requirements that regularly and significantly exceed that figure. The ratio is the point. The gap between what it is worth and what it costs to own is the entire story. A billion-dollar asset that loses money every year, reliably, without exception. That is the financial monument William Randolph Hearst left behind. The philosophical question that Hearst Castle poses is not about architecture or wealth or even ego, though it touches all of these. It is about the relationship between creation and control, about the difference between building something and owning it, about the ways in which the things we build in our image can outlast and outrun and ultimately escape our intentions for them. Hearst built the castle to be his. In every conceivable way, the design, the art, the entertaining, the operation, the ongoing construction, the castle was an expression of his will, his taste, his power, his vision. It was, for the duration of his active engagement with it, an extension of himself into the physical world. But buildings do not remain extensions of their builders. They develop their own demands, their own logic, their own relationship with time and entropy and cost. They become things in themselves, separate from the intentions that created them. The castle became its own thing. It has its own agenda now. The agenda of a structure of this complexity, which is to continue existing and to extract from whoever is responsible for it the resources required for that continued existence. Hearst thought he was building a kingdom. He was building a creditor. There is a detail about the Neptune pool that carries an almost poetic weight. The pool has leaked off and on for decades. The precise mechanism of the leakage, cracks in the foundation, faults in the original construction, the behavior of the hillside soil beneath the structure has been the subject of extensive investigation and repeated repair attempts. The state has spent millions of dollars on Neptune pool repairs and conservation. At various points, the pool has been drained, left empty for extended periods while engineering assessments were conducted, and repair plans were developed and executed. The most recent major repair, completed in 2018 after the pool was drained for several years, cost approximately $14 million. $14 million to repair one pool, one of the 2 pools on the property. On a property that, in total, generates roughly $28 million a year in admission revenue. The pool consumed half a year's revenue in a single repair, and it will need repair again. Because pools built into hillsides in earthquake-prone coastal California in the 1920s, by construction crews working under conditions that did not anticipate a century of use and public access, those pools will always need repair again. The Neptune pool is not a maintenance problem. It is a permanent condition, an ongoing obligation that will outlast any particular repair and any particular budget, and any particular administration of the state institution responsible for it. It is the castle's metabolism expressed in a single concrete basin. Stand on the hilltop at San Simeon on a clear day and look north along the California coast. The Santa Lucia Mountains descend in long ridges to the ocean. The Pacific extends to the horizon, flat and silver in the afternoon light. 500,000 acres of ranch land spread out below you, still owned by the Hearst Corporation, still producing cattle and generating the revenue of a working agricultural operation. The castle stands above all of it, towers rising from the hilltop, the gardens immaculate, the pools gleaming. It looks like what Hearst intended it to look like power, like permanence, like an argument about what is possible when ambition and resources combine without limit. And if you know the numbers, the maintenance costs, the gap between revenue and expense, the $14 million pool repair, the decades of state subsidy, the fact that no private buyer has ever been willing to take it on, the beauty becomes complicated. Because you are looking at the most expensive proof in American history that scale is not the same as value, that magnificence is not the same as sustainability, that the accumulation of beautiful things at sufficient cost and complexity can produce an object that is simultaneously extraordinary and impossible. The castle is both of these things simultaneously. It always has been. From the first day of construction to the present morning, it has been both extraordinary and impossible. Hearst lived in the extraordinary and ignored the impossible. The impossible outlived him. If you believe that the size of a house reflects the security of a fortune, look at Hearst Castle. If you believe that the accumulation of beautiful and expensive things is the same as the creation of wealth, look at Hearst Castle. If you believe that a man at the peak of his earning power, surrounded by evidence of his own success, is necessarily making sound decisions about the deployment of that earning power, look at Hearst Castle. Because here is what the castle actually demonstrates. Wealth is not measured in rooms. It is not measured in pools or tapestries or the number of species in your private zoo or the length of your private road or the square footage of marble in your indoor swimming pool. Wealth is measured in what continues to work in your absence, what generates returns when you are not present to demand them, what compounds quietly and independently and produces income that exceeds cost and grows over time. The castle did none of these things. It was the opposite of all of them. It was a machine for consuming the wealth that other, more financially rational parts of the Hearst Empire generated. It was the drain at the center of the balance sheet, the obligation that could not be reduced, the asset that was not an asset in any meaningful financial sense. It was beautiful. It was extraordinary. It was the physical embodiment of one of the most powerful personalities in American history. And it could not pay for itself. Not in 1937, not in 1957, not in 2024. The beauty and the financial failure are not in contradiction. They are the same thing. The beauty is the financial failure. The ambition that produced the extraordinary rooms and the extraordinary art and the extraordinary views also produced the extraordinary cost and the extraordinary obligations and the extraordinary impossibility of ownership that has defined the castle's financial story for a century. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot build at this scale and this intensity for this long, in defiance of completion and cost, and expect the result to be a rational asset. What you get is a monument, and monuments are expensive. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951. He was 87 years old. He died in the Beverly Hills house that Marion Davies owned, far from the hilltop that had consumed more of his life and resources than any other single thing. His estate, at the time of his death, was substantially less magnificent than it had been at his peak. The financial crises of the 1930s, the art sales, the restructuring of the business, the decades of spending against declining income, all of it had reduced what he left behind. The castle went to California. The newspaper empire continued under the management of the Hearst Corporation, eventually becoming one of the more durable media companies in American history, surviving the disruption of television and the internet in ways that many of its contemporaries did not. The castle became a state park, a tourist attraction, a destination. It became, in death, what it could never have been in life, self-sustaining, or nearly self-sustaining, or at least sustained with assistance by the collective resources of the state of California and the millions of visitors who pay to walk through its rooms. Hearst wanted the castle to outlast him. It has. Dramatically, unmistakably, on its own terms, the castle has outlasted him. Whether this is the victory he intended is a question only the castle's silence can answer. The last thing to understand about Hearst Castle is the most important one. It is not a cautionary tale about excess. It is not a warning against ambition or scale or the desire to build something magnificent. It is a story about the difference between creating value and creating obligation, between building something that works for you and building something that works against you, between an asset that generates returns and an asset that generates demands. The distinction matters. It matters enormously. Because it is a distinction that is easy to miss when the building is rising and the parties are happening, and the guest list includes everyone who matters, and the money is flowing in faster than it is flowing out. It is only visible from the outside, looking in, from a position of distance with access to the numbers, with the willingness to see through the magnificence to the mathematics underneath. The mathematics underneath Hearst Castle were always the same. From the first stone to the last, they said, "This costs more than it produces. This demands more than it returns. This is not an asset. This is an appetite. Hearst looked at those numbers for 30 years and declined to see them clearly. Because the castle was not a financial decision, it was a human one, and humans, at the scale that Hearst operated, can refuse to hear the mathematics for a very long time. The mathematics, however, are patient. They waited, and when the time came, they collected. If you found yourself standing in the refectory of Hearst Castle, beneath the 15th century choir stalls and the medieval tapestries and the ceiling that Hearst bought from a monastery in Spain and shipped across an ocean, and you had to make one decision about where to put your money, what would you choose? Something beautiful that costs more than it earns, or something invisible that earns more than it costs? Most people, if they're honest, feel the pull of the beautiful. That pull is the story of Hearst Castle. Drop your answer below. And if you've ever made a financial decision based on how something felt rather than what it cost, tell me what you built and what it eventually cost you to keep it. A billionaire built one of the largest private estates in America. The castle won. It always does. Because the castle doesn't need to be right. It just needs to still be standing when you run out of money. Hearst thought he owned the castle. The castle owned him. And that's the difference between wealth and something that only looks like it.